is a narrative retelling of creation to the end of Second Kings. It tells the exact same story another way. Then after that, you get things like the Psalms, the wisdom books, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. These are all books of teachings. They're not books of history. The Psalms are the hymn book that they used in Israel. And then you'll get things like the prophets. And then these prophets will be active at any time in the previous history that they've gone through. So when you're reading in the Old Testament, you say, oh, now we have Jeremiah, let's say. You kind of have to do some figuring out, okay, Jeremiah is happening during this time inside of the book of Kings, right? Those books happen concurrently inside those bigger books. It's like it's one person's perspective of what's going on when Kings gives you the overview of what's happening. Now, eventually you get to some books that are in the middle of the exile, and that's where you get Daniel, right? Daniel happens in the middle of the exile. There's a couple other prophets that are active during that exile. And then after that, to finish up the history of Israel, you have to read Ezra and Nehemiah. So we'll just kind of zoom down to the end here, because that'll give you kind of how we're actually going to be able to kind of wrap this up before we transition into the fall pretty well, with you guys getting a good picture of the history of Israel. Because next time, we're not going to do Chronicles. We're going to hop all the way to Daniel. And the reason for that is because the Kings takes us to the beginning of the Babylonian exile. Then Daniel gives us a look of what it looks like inside of that exile. And then after that, on August 29th, we'll do Ezra and Nehemiah, which tells the story of what happens when they're allowed to come back to the land after the exile. And then Nehemiah actually takes us to the furthest point historically of the Old Testament. We have Malachi, who is the last Old Testament book, is a prophet working at that time. But as far as the history, what we've gotten really used to reading is this history narrative, right? One event after another. That's how the Bible's been telling its stories. Well, that will end in Ezra and Nehemiah. And so on September 5th, we're going to kind of take a step back, and we'll do a little bit of that, putting the prophets where they belong, so that you have an idea of how the rest of the Old Testament is put together. Does that make sense? So we will get to complete the Old Testament this summer before we transition on September 12th. Now, let's talk for a second about September 12th before we start our video. On September 12th, we, the adults, are moving into the big room, and we are sharing the space with the Sunday school. And it won't be easy necessarily at first, and it'll take a little bit getting used to, but it will be a lot of fun. We're going to see our confirmation students joining the adult Bible study. Nice. And a few other students that the Sunday school board said, you know what, I bet they would really benefit from being in your class, Pastor, because they want to go a little bit more in depth. So we're going to have a combination class of young and old in our adult Bible study, and I think we'll really benefit from that. We get to, we get to see the childlike faith, and they get to see our wisdom. And hopefully we can grow from one another. And so with that, we're going to be switching our curriculum to follow what's happening in Sunday school, so that what we are learning corresponds to what the little kids are learning. So hopefully that can inspire more cross-pollination conversation. One of my prayers is to get more of the Sunday school parents to this study, so that they can see what their kids are learning and be able to engage in conversation about that throughout the week. That's kind of the big, sky view kind of thought process here. And so that will start, actually conveniently enough, with the beginning of Luke. So we will be making a good transition from the end of the history of the Old Testament into the beginning of the history of the New Testament, with the birth of Jesus in Luke 1. Any questions about any of that?
It's a beautiful plan. My Bible says there's one more history book that we may not get. Is Esther considered a history book?
Esther is kind of like Ruth, where it's a little novella that happens during the broader history of Israel. So it's very similar in genre to Ruth, but also contains a lot of poetry. So it's like a halfway between Ruth and Song of Solomon almost.
So that's why it's between Nehemiah and Job, Psalms, Proverbs.
Yes, it's kind of half wisdom literature, half historical narrative. It's a very unique book. It's a very unique. It kind of defies categorization almost. But yeah, we're going to be focusing on finishing out the history of Israel so that in our study we have this solid narrative, creation to the end of the Old Testament era. And then we'll, even when we're doing our conversation on September 5th on framing the Old Testament, we'll even talk a little bit about what happens in between during that intertestamental period. The intertestamental period. Some people say those are the silent years. They were pretty loud. There was a lot of things that happened in world history during that time that really sets the stage for what happens in the New Testament. Okay, all that out of the way. Been talking way too long about all this. So we need to slide over and I need to find the video, which I did not preload it this time like I should have because I was making sure the live stream was working. So just give me just a second. But yeah, this is just another time to just share with you. All these videos that we go over are all free resources on the website, BibleProject.com. And they are easy to find and they are really high quality. Personally, I diversify my giving. I give to the church, of course, but I also like to give to the Bible Project because I really support the work they do. I think they produce some of the finest biblical teaching resources on the planet. We'll come over here and I'll share this here in a second once I get it all ready to go. No, don't start yet. Let's see here. Are you going to give me a full screen option? You might not get a full screen option. What if I do this? Well, let me do that. Yeah, it will let me do that. It's just not going to go very quickly. Okay, this is what we're going to do. I'll make it big. Okay, now I'm going to share. Ready?
The books of 1st and 2nd Kings, although they're two separate books in our Bibles, they were originally written as one book telling a unified story that continues on from the book of Samuel that came before it. So David has unified the tribes of Israel into a kingdom, and God promised that from his line would come a messianic king who would establish God's kingdom over the nations and fulfill the promises made to Abraham. So the book of Kings tells the story of the long line of kings that came after David, and none of them lived up to that promise. In fact, they run the nation of Israel right into the ground. The book is designed to have 5 main movements. The story begins and ends focus on Jerusalem, first with Solomon's reign and the construction of the temple, and then in this last section ending with Jerusalem's destruction and Israel's exile to Babylon. And the story leading up to this tragedy is what makes up the center 3 sections, which explain how Israel split into 2 rival kingdoms, how God tried to prevent the corruption of Israel by sending the prophets, and how exile became the unavoidable consequence of Israel's sin. The book opens with 2 chapters about the kingdom passing from the aging David to his son Solomon. And David's final words to Solomon, they're very similar to those of Moses and Joshua and Samuel to the people. It's a call to remain faithful to the commands of the covenant and to give allegiance to the God of Israel alone. But David's words ring somewhat hollow here because David and Solomon then go on to conspire how they're going to consolidate this new kingdom through a whole series of political assassinations. It's not off to a great start. Solomon's brightest moment comes when he asks God for wisdom to lead Israel, and he even completes David's dream to make a temple for the God of Israel. Here the story actually stops and describes the design of this temple in detail, just like the tabernacle design in the Torah. There's all these gold and jewels and depictions of angels and fruit trees. It's all symbolism echoing back to the Garden of Eden. It's the place where heaven and earth meet, where God's presence dwells with his people. But no sooner does Solomon finish the temple than he makes some really horrible choices, and the kingdom falls apart. He starts marrying the daughters of other kings, hundreds of their gods, and introduces the worship of those gods into Israel. Solomon then accumulates huge amounts of wealth. He builds a huge army. He even institutes slave labor for all of his building projects. Now, if you go back to the Torah and look at God's guidelines for Israel's kings in Deuteronomy 17, Solomon is breaking every one. So by the time that he dies, Solomon resembles Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, more than he does his father David. The next section of the book opens with Solomon's son, Rehoboam, acting just like his father. It's a very sad story of greed and lust for power. He tries to increase taxes for slave labor. And under the leadership of Jeroboam, the northern tribes reject this, they rebel and secede, and form their own rival kingdom. And so now in the story, you have the southern kingdom, Judah, centered in Jerusalem with kings from the line of David, and now this new northern kingdom called Israel, whose capital will be Samaria eventually. Jeroboam also goes on to build 2 new temples to compete with Solomon's temple in the south. He puts a golden calf in each one to represent the God of Israel. The connection to Exodus 32 and the golden calf, it's all quite explicit. From this point on, the story goes back and forth from north to south, tracing the fate of both kingdoms. Each one had about 20 successive kings, and as the author introduces each king, he evaluates their reign by a few criteria. Did they worship the God of Israel alone, or did they promote the worship of other gods? Did they deal with idolatry among the people? And did they remain faithful to the covenant like David, or do they become corrupt and unjust? And according to these criteria, the author finds no good kings in northern Israel, 0 for 20. And then in southern Judah, only 8 out of 20 get a positive rating, which connects to another huge purpose in this book, and that's to introduce the role of the prophets, key figures in Israel's history. So in the Bible, prophets were not fortune tellers. Rather, they spoke on behalf of the God of Israel, and they played the role of covenant watchdogs, which means they called out idolatry and injustice among the kings and the people. They were constantly reminding Israel of their calling to be a light to the nations, that they should obey the commands of the Torah, and so the prophets challenged Israel to repent and follow their God. In these center sections for each king, God then raises up prophets to hold them accountable. And the most prominent prophets are the northern ones, Elijah and his disciple Elisha, right here in the center of the book. Elijah was a wild man of a prophet living out in the desert, and his arch nemesis was the northern king Ahab and his Canaanite wife Jezebel. Together, these two had instituted the worship of the Canaanite god Baal over Israel. And so in a famous story, Elijah challenged 450 prophets of Baal to a contest to see which god was real. So they both build altars and pray to their gods, but only the God of Israel answers with fire. After this, Ahab uses his royal power to murder an Israelite farmer and then steal his family's vineyard. And Elijah again confronts Ahab's injustice, and he announces the downfall of his house. Elijah eventually passes the mantle of his prophetic leadership to a young disciple named Elisha, who asks for 2 times the authority of Elijah. And what's fascinating here is how the author, he's recounted 7 miraculous feats for Elijah, and then he offers stories of 14 acts of power from Elisha. Both prophets were clearly remarkable men, and they played the same role, confronting Israel's kings for idolatry and injustice. And ultimately, they were unsuccessful in turning Israel back from apostasy. In the next section, the northern kingdom is rocked by a bloody revolution started by a king named Jehu, who destroys Ahab's family. And although Jehu was at first commissioned by God, his violence just gets out of control, and it creates the spiral of political assassinations and rebellions from which Israel never recovered. Coup follows coup after Jehu, and each king follows other gods, allows horrible injustice. It all leads up to 2 Kings chapter 17. The big bad empire of Assyria swoops down and takes out the northern kingdom altogether. In the capital city of Samaria, it's conquered, and the Israelites are exiled and scattered throughout the ancient world. Now, chapter 17 is key. The author stops the story and offers this prophetic reflection on what's just happened. He blames the downfall of the northern kingdom on the idolatry and covenant unfaithfulness of Israel and its kings. And so, God has allowed them to face the consequences of their decisions. The final movement of the book tells the story of the lone southern kingdom. And here we meet some very heroic kings, like Hezekiah, who trusts God when the armies of Assyria come knocking on Jerusalem's door, or Josiah, who discovers this lost scroll of the Torah in the temple. So he starts reading it, he's convicted, and he institutes religious reforms to remove idolatry and Canaanite influences from the land. But Judah is just too far gone. The king, right in between these two, Manasseh, he's the worst by far. So he not only introduces the worship of idol statues into the Jerusalem temple, he also institutes child sacrifice. And so God sends prophets to say, the time is up. Israel has reached the point of no return. The final chapters tell the story of the Babylonian Empire coming to invade Jerusalem, destroy the temple, and carry the people and the royal line of David off into exile. And so the story ends leaving us wondering, is God done with Israel? Is he done with the line of David? Well, the final paragraph zooms about 40 years forward into the exile, and it tells a very odd story. It's about Jehoiakim, a descendant from David, who would have been king if he was back in Jerusalem. And the king of Babylon releases him from prison and invites him to eat at the royal table for the rest of his life, and the book ends. So it's not much, but it's a story that gives a glimmer of hope that God has not abandoned the line of David. So the question now is, how is God going to fulfill his promises to Abraham, to David? How is he going to bless the nations and bring the Messianic kingdom? And to answer those questions, you have to read on into the wisdom and the prophetic books. But for now, that's the book of Kings.
Okay. David has unified the tribes of Israel into one kingdom. The kings run Israel right into the... David tells Solomon to stay. Didn't work out too well.
No, it didn't, not at all.
The temple is adorned with symbolism that takes us back to the Garden of Eden. In the end, Solomon resembles Pharaoh more than his own father. And I kind of goofed on this line. So, Northern Israel,
0.
get big fat, right, 0 for 20. So this should be blank for 20.
Yeah.
Here, not blank for 8, which gives you the answer, though. Southern Israel is 8 for 20. 8. Yeah, so mark out that 8, put 20 there. The prophets end up announcing that Israel has hit the
Point of no return.
Yeah, the point of no return. What is something that you learned from the video?
I didn't realize there wasn't that many good kings.
Yeah, I know.
Most of them were bad.
Most are bad, a few were good. I have a slide from a previous study I did a while ago where I just have all their names, and I have the bad ones in red and I have the good ones in green. And even like the good ones in green, like sometimes I have them half green and half red. Like Solomon, he starts off green, then he turns red, right?
I can't get over how the Old Testament is so much blood and guts. Yeah. All they do is kill each other and fight.
Yeah.
Although Israel to this day is still fighting.
It's true.
I mean, they never learned their lessons.
So this is the result of putting your trust in a king rather than just the abiding presence of God. That where the king goes, the kingdom goes. And we see that happen. But the north just goes off right away. They put 2 golden calves, one in Bethel, one in Dan. And it's interesting because when they make this image, they are implying that the image is Yahweh, that they are worshiping Yahweh. But God said no images. And so don't do that, right? And then they see Yahweh as just another image. And so that makes it really easy to put him right next to a Baal or an Asherah pole or whatever it is, a Dagon. And then Yahweh is just one of many. And you know what? If Jezebel really likes Baal, well, we're going to be Baal worshipers for a generation. And that's just how it goes. Anything else you picked up or something that stood out to you?
I liked how the prophets had simple, clear criteria for good or bad. I mean, it's not that complicated.
Yeah. And it's if the king understood, well, what we've been covering from the beginning here of Genesis, the history of Israel, how they got to be where they are, who they are, what God has done for them, how God has always been there for them, then they wouldn't forsake it.
There you go. You lead it right into Josiah weeping because he found out when he read, this is a repeating cycle.
Yeah. And we believe he found the Torah. He found, the Genesis through Deuteronomy. And it's like, this is our people. This is where we come from. But see, it's a lot harder to remember who you are in, mostly illiterate society. And that's why it's so hard. Jesus is so harsh, and the prophets are so harsh on the scribes, the kings, the priests, because it's their job to communicate to the people their story and remind them who they are. And so when they don't do that, when they fail that responsibility, well, then you get Jeremiah in the temple courts, really railing against the establishment of the Jerusalem temple. Because the temple goes on throughout all this, but it becomes apostate. It becomes a place for people with means to pay for fancy sacrifices so they can look better than everybody else. And you see the seeds of what Jesus is going to rail against in this era. And you even see it rear its ugly head. And we'll talk more about this when we get to Ezra and Nehemiah when they establish the second temple. God does not come to dwell in the second temple. And that's very intentional that the Bible wants us to know that.
Wasn't the downfall of Israel wanting a king? Wasn't?
Possibly. I mean, it's not like they were doing much better in the era of the judges. They were on the same trajectory.
It seemed like they went worse after they got a kingdom.
I think with the kings, if they had a king that would show the example, that was good. Like, Israel was at its best at the end of David's reign.
Right.
Those were the glory days.
And after David went all downhill.
Mm-hmm. And that's why I remember I told you about the little fort town at Sha'arim in Israel overlooking the valley of Elah where David fought Goliath. And it was that one town where there was no idol box, and that whenever people were there, they actually worshiped God the way they should. That was during David's reign. But every other site across Israel, every city that has a long history has idol boxes. They fell into apostasy, and that was more their story than faithfulness. That was one of the things that really smacked me in the face when I went to the land. Because I guess we have this concept of, back in the day, the kingdom of Israel, they worshiped God, and it was this community. But the actual time they actually did what they were supposed to do was so small in the scope of the history of Israel. It's just it's a few decades at most in the scope of hundreds of years, generations and generations.
But God gave so many chances to people, and it would be like, okay, I'm gonna let this go. And then bam, it was like, all right.
Yeah.
He sent me over, and sometimes I think in today's world, it's the same way, because it's so evil, and then.
Yeah. Dr. Bierman at the seminary talked about the rubber banding effect of culture. That, you know, if you have like a tight society with good order, discipline, structure, faith life that helps govern it and helps you keep to that structure, right? Because you have meaning and purpose, you're going to try to live intentionally with your life, right? Society will be pretty strong. But the more wanton sin enters a society, the rubber band will just kind of start to stretch. And people will start to see what they can get away with, and they'll get away with a little more, so it'll stretch. And then sometime natural law, which is the consequences of our sins, steps up to the plate, and boom, there's a big something or another that shows us the error of our ways, and that'll bring us back to norm. And that's what Dr. Bierman believes is going to happen to our society at some point within the next generation or two. The American project will come. The American project will come tumbling down within the next couple hundred years.
It makes you wonder that there had to have been something in the ways of the world that was attractive to all these people. What was it? Was it wealth? Was it sex orgies? Was it some kind of recognition of power? But the general people just loved to, they had all advantages of the true God, and yet they constantly sought after other things. There must have been something attractive in the world to do that.
You want me to touch on that before we get to your comment, Scott?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think there's a number of reasons. I think the fundamental thing, though, if I was going to break it down, is that people trust far more what they see than what they know to be true. And so physical idols standing next to each other and the drama that surrounds them are quite visible. You can see them, you can imagine them, you can play games with them in your head, not unlike the modern phenomena of superheroes. Comic books, movies, television shows are all very visual mediums, and they're very engaging because they're visual mediums. And so kids latch onto them right away because they're very visual, they can bring you into their world. And I think that was much the same way with idolatry. That there was visuals that came around it that children could latch on to, and you take a generation, you know, like, I mean, I'm a kid that grew up on TV. I have a soft spot in my heart for the cartoons I grew up with, right? That's just because of the way I was raised. But it's much harder to say, this stuff that you're seeing is not real. This is the God who has no image, who are to worship in this way. And that all has to be communicated orally. That all has to be communicated through your hearing. You have to hear about this God. You have to hear about the stories of the Exodus. You know, I don't think they were at the point where they were making big, stained glass images of the Exodus at that point, which might have helped them. But I don't know. I think that's part of it. But also, I think the to your point about the orgies, Herb, that there was a lot more licentiousness in the cultic practices of these other gods. There were such things as temple prostitutes. These gods have a lot more character flaws and are much more exciting and dramatic. Just think about the stories of the Greek and Roman pantheons. They're always killing each other and doing things, and there's much more drama involved in that. And I think that was part of the attraction too. And if you marry someone who grew up in Baal worship, especially if you're a guy and you marry a woman who's really into Baal, you're going to be really into Baal pretty soon.
And children too.
Mm-hmm.
It's the way they're raised and what parents believe or what the children usually believe or follow.
And we see this big forsaking of what Exodus spent chapters trying to communicate is, write it on the walls. right? Put it on the doorways. Wear it on your wrists. Remember who God is, the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. You know, catechize through teaching and put reminders everywhere of who you are. I mean, Exodus and Leviticus, you know, they're all designed about trying to provide ways to remind people again and again who they are and what we do. And so why do I got to go to church every week if it's the same old story? Because if you don't, you're going to forget who you are, right? Because there'll be other things that are more attractive out there in the world, other stories that are more compelling than the story that you were raised with. And so you better keep on hearing this, what I believe is the most compelling story ever told, because it defines you, gives you meaning, identity, and purpose. Scott, were you going to say something?
Just something Jim said about David. I don't know the history of all the kings, but to me, David was the one that showed humility, repentance. And I think that might have something to do with the success of the community during David's reign. He allowed himself to be humbled, and I don't think these other kings did.
If a prophet came to like Ahab and said, you are the man who committed this sin, repent before Yahweh your God, they would have been beheaded.
Yeah.
Right? David's the one that listened to Nathan the prophet. He listened to the word of God when it was presented to him. Again, as we've said before, David's not a perfect man, but his faith is something that we aspire to, that when we are confronted with our sins, we don't kill the messenger. And since I'm still alive, you guys are doing all right so far.
That's new yet.
It's only been 2 years.
Yeah.
Here, I'm gonna pull up a little bit of First Kings for us. Again, you know, I know it seems like we don't get hardly enough time to hop into the scriptures, but that's kind of the point of this class, is to give you the understanding and the groundwork so that when you approach the scriptures, you're not lost. You kind of understand what's going on, what the context is, why the things are happening the way they do. Because so many times when we hop into the scriptures, we're like, what is going on? This is crazy. I'm never going to touch this book again.
Which could be the true value of these videos. We now know they exist. We know where they are. We can revisit these videos and not have a Bible study and still get the context of the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm. Well, and very frankly, I use these videos professionally all the time.
They're great.
Before, like if I'm coming into the lectionary and I'm seeing that I have a reading for 2 Corinthians and I haven't touched 2 Corinthians in a while, I go straight to the video first, and it reacquaints me with the narrative that surrounds 2 Corinthians so that I know how to best proclaim it to our context, to what's going on with us. What is similar to our situation that's similar in Corinth? And that's where I can proclaim the text clearly. And the same with the Old Testament. You know, I won't say I read Hezekiah every week. I don't. I mean, my nose is in the Bible somewhere every week, but you know, it might be 2 or 3 years since I've spent any work with Hezekiah. I go to these videos because they bring me back to they remind me a lot of what I experienced in the seminary classroom. And that's one of the reasons why I really jived with them so much, because they were teaching the scriptures with a same methodology that I was learning too in seminary. And that's why I really liked them so much.
My biggest problem with the Old Testament is trying to pronounce everybody's names.
Yeah,
That's what I struggle with.
I skip over most of them because I can't pronounce them. And I know if I tried, I'd pronounce it wrong.
Hey, Scott, what's that first citation I have under there, under zooming in?
1 Kings 8.
Oh, 8. I hopped to 6.
1 through 22. And my Bible subheading is the ark brought into the temple and Solomon blesses the Lord. Yeah, that's interesting subtitle.
So I'm going to share my iPad.
to me, and sometimes there's two people with the same name,
The same name,
but they will,
and they tell you whose mother they were and everything else. Oh, yeah.
I know, it can be easy to get lost in the alphabet soup of names.
What chapter is it that everyone begot so-and-so?
Well, that's Matthew 1, yeah. And
That's another one that I.
so, pay attention to the names that you hear multiple times and start to see a pattern with them, right? So we know David and so those are the ones that are gonna, the ones that you really need to stick to. But if you get lost in the web of names, don't worry about it too much. I'm just gonna read this, 1 Kings 8. Then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the leaders of the fathers' houses of the people of Israel, before King Solomon in Jerusalem, to bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of the city of David, which is Zion, which is another name for Jerusalem. And all the men of Israel assembled to King Solomon in the feast in the month Ethanim. That's the name of a Hebrew month. You don't need to know what that means. It's just a month, which is the 7th month. It tells you. And all the elders of Israel came. And the priests took up the ark, and they brought up the ark of the Lord, the tent of meeting, and all the holy vessels that were in the tent. The priests and all the Levites brought them up, and King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel who had assembled before him were with him before the ark, sacrificing so many sheep and oxen that they could not be counted or numbered. Just as an aside here, this is the tabernacle that they started out in the wilderness for, and it's at this point just about 500 years old. That the tabernacle has been in use. It's pretty amazing to me. In King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel, 6, verse 6. Then the priests brought the ark of the covenant of the Lord to its place in the inner sanctuary of the house, in the most holy place, underneath the wings of the cherubim. For the cherubim spread out their wings over the place of the ark, so that the cherubim overshadowed the ark and its poles. And the poles were so long that the ends of the poles were seen from the holy place before the inner sanctuary, but they could not be seen from outside. And there they are to this day. I love comments like that. That means when this was written, the temple had not yet crumbled. So that gives you a little peek into the perspective of the scribe. Look for those comments. They're kind of fun. Scholars love them because it gives us evidence of the authorship. There was nothing in the ark except the 2 tablets of stone that Moses put there at Horeb, where the Lord made a covenant with the people of Israel when they came out of the land of Egypt. And when the priests came out of the holy place, a cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. And that's our evidence right there, that the physical presence of God came and dwelt in that temple. That glory of the Lord, you want to watch for those words. The cloud, same cloud that brought them through the wilderness, right? The same presence of God that walked with Adam and Eve in the garden dwelt in this temple. So Solomon was doing something right when he started. And once we get to Ezra and Nehemiah, we want to be careful attention to see if that happens when they build the second temple. And it's telling that it doesn't. Then Solomon said, "The Lord has said that he would dwell in thick darkness, but I have indeed built you an exalted house, a place for you to dwell in forever." Then the king turned around and blessed all the assembly of Israel, while all the assembly of Israel stood. And he said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who with his hand has fulfilled what he promised with his mouth to David my father, saying, since the day that I brought my people of Israel out of Egypt, I chose no city out of all the tribes of Israel in which to build a house, that my name might be there. But I chose David to be over my people Israel. Now it was in the heart of David, my father, to build a house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. The Lord said to David, my father, whereas it was in your heart to build a house for my name. You did well that was in your heart. Nevertheless, you shall not build the house, but your son, who shall be born to you, shall build the house for my name. That was 2 Samuel 7 when God had said that. Now the Lord had fulfilled his promise that he made, for I have risen in the place of David my father and sit on the throne of Israel, as the Lord promised. And I have built the house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel, and there I have provided a place for the ark, in which is the covenant of the Lord that he made with our fathers when he brought them out of Egypt. And then it segues to the prayer, which is a cool prayer. It's a very cool prayer.
I have a question. Why so many times after one of the kings died or something, it said it wasn't recorded in the annals of the history?
Yeah.
Why? Was it just that they didn't think they were important, or
That's an excellent question.
why wasn't it ever recorded? But it happened so many times. That's what I could see once or twice, but it happened more often than that.
I guess they were seen to not do anything significant.
I
But
don't know.
as just like I said, as a historical note, whenever we get reference to the annals, that's really interesting because we do not have extant copies of whatever these annals are.
No.
We only get reference to them in 1st and 2nd Kings, and in Chronicles talks about some supporting documents that it uses too. But we don't know what these annals are.
Yeah.
They were probably burned in a library in Jerusalem when Babylon took over. That's my best guess.
Would they be like a scroll or something?
Oh yeah, this is all scrolls. This is all scrolls.
Yeah, that amazed me though, that how many times in there it says that it wasn't recorded. It's just like the person wasn't important or something, don't worry about it.
I got so much ink to spill.
Yeah, well, that must be what it was.
1st and 2nd Kings are only divided 1st and 2nd Kings because they had to fit on 2 scrolls. Same with 1st and 2nd Samuel. They're one continuous narrative, but they had to be separated because of their length. So we have Solomon here bringing the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem in the temple, and we see that this is going well. It almost seems like everything is being fulfilled that was prophesied in 2 Samuel 7. We have a son of David who is establishing his throne, and if things go right, this could go on forever, and this could be a good thing. Now, sadly, we're running close on time. We were going to hop to later where everything falls apart for Solomon, right? Where everything falls apart, where we hear of the concubines, the trade deals, the false worship that enters Jerusalem. And so we're left to wonder, what happened to the son of David who was going to establish his throne forever when this happens? So as a reader, we're kind of on edge because we were told to expect something that didn't happen. So then take yourself out of the position of being a Christian and understanding the full story. Like, what are you looking for after you see Solomon fall? What are you looking for as you read the scriptures?
For everybody to be good and believe in God and just keep going, but it doesn't happen.
We're looking for a son of David, right?
Yeah. I was going to say the Messiah. We're looking for that.
Mm-hmm.
Keep working toward that or something.
Well, because Solomon, right here in what we just read, he sounds like a Messiah.
Yeah.
He sounds like a Messiah, that he is doing everything that God called him to do. He is an anointed one, or Messiah just means anointed. Solomon is the Messiah of Israel at this point. But it's just when he falls, well, now we're looking for a different Messiah. We're looking for a different Messiah. And it becomes even more, has even more agony, because then we have the split of the land. The two sons war with each other. So northern goes one way, southern goes one way. So shoot, the Messiah was supposed to have a unified kingdom. What's going on here? Where is this Messiah going to be? And it's not until we get to Isaiah's prophetic times
I was
where
gonna say, you have to look for different clues or signs to narrow in on who the Messiah is.
the prophets are going to bring the torch back and say, remember when God promised a son of David? It's still coming, friends. It's still coming, friends. Okay. Well, I think that's a good place to stop right now. So throughout the story of the Bible, we're looking for the threads of when is this Messiah to come, how people hold on to the hope for that Messiah. So while this was tough, we still had stories of like Elijah holding on. You know, remember that point where Elijah was so depressed because he thought no one was faithful left, but then he found that remnant of 7,000, right? There's an undercurrent here. Elisha has a powerful ministry, and they kind of prefigure the type of ministry Jesus is going to have with the miracles and all this stuff. And even as we go into Babylon, there'll be a little boy Daniel who prays toward Jerusalem every day because he's holding on hope that there will be a Messiah. Let's see, I'll stop sharing. And we'll conclude with the morning prayer. I thank you, my heavenly Father, Jesus Christ, your dear Son, that you kept me this night from all harm and danger. And I pray that you would keep me this day also from sin and every evil, that all my doings in life may please you. For into your hands I commend myself, my body and soul and all things. Let your holy angel be with me, that the evil foe may have no power over me. Amen.
Herb, thank you so much for all your work at RLA. It looks great. Herb was out there every day, I think, working on the property.
We can't hear you guys because you're muted. That's okay. We'll see you in worship soon, okay? We'll see ya.